At 51, Adeline Vance had nothing to her name but a widow's black dress gone gray at the seams, a chip tin of coins, and a cough she could not quite shake. The bank had taken the rest, her farm, her furniture, the yellow curtains she had sewn by lamplight, and it was Silas Thorne, president of the Cedar Bluff Farmers Trust, who signed the paper that put her out on the road because her Tom had died in debt, and a dead man's debt, Thorne said, was still a debt. She counted what she had left on the courthouse steps, $9.40. And with it she did a thing the whole town would call foolish for a generation. She walked to the county auction and bought the old Finn Gristmill, the collapsing ruin on the far bank of the Kettle River, for $8, because no one else would raise a hand. They laughed. They said she'd bought herself a grave with a roof. But there was something sealed beneath those millstones, quiet and patient through 30 years of dust, that would not only lift her out of ruin, it would give a forgotten town back its heart. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Vance. And if you are watching this from a place the world seems to have driven past and forgotten, a town that used to matter and doesn't anymore, tell us in the comments where you're from. We would like to know you're out there. To understand why a woman with $8 would buy a broken mill, you have to understand the girl she had been and the man who raised her. Adeline was born Adeline Kerr in the spring of 1838 in a sod and timber house on the high grass of what would later be called Cedar Bluff, when the Kettle River still ran fat and loud and the whole valley smelled of turned earth and wood smoke. Her father, Amos Kerr, was the first miller the valley ever had. He came west with 2 French burr stones lashed in a wagon bed, stones he loved the way other men loved horses, and he built a mill on the river before there was a church, before there was a store, before there was anything at all but families scattered across the grass, hungry and far from home. Amos used to tell her that a town is not made by its bank or its saloon or even its church. A town is made, he said, by the place where people bring their grain and go home fed. That place was his mill. And Adeline grew up inside the great, warm heartbeat of it, in the grind and the hush and the fine white dust that settled in her hair like early snow. Her father taught her everything, though it was not the custom to teach a girl such things. He taught her to read the water and dress the stones, to feel with her bare palm whether the meal ran too hot, to true a wheel and mend a gear, and coax a sullen mechanism back to life with patience instead of force. But more than the craft, he taught her a way of seeing. Amos Kerr could not abide waste. He kept a shelf of things other people had thrown away, a cracked crock he'd wired back together, a busted clock he'd made keep time again, a lame mule he'd nursed until it plowed straight. Most everything folks throw off, he'd say, turning some rescued object in his big dusty hands, still has all its worth inside it. They just quit looking. And he taught her the honest arithmetic of the mill, that a miller who cheated the poor was the lowest kind of thief, because he stole from the very people who trusted him to be fair. Amos took his toll in grain, a fixed and modest measure, and never a grain more, and he wrote every transaction in a great leather ledger in his careful slanting hand, so that any man could come and see he'd been dealt with square. She also learned, in that mill, what it meant to be trusted. In those early years there was no bank within 40 miles, and folk did not trust the far-off cities with what little they had. So, they trusted Amos. A farmer who sold a good crop would bring his coins to the miller and ask him to keep them safe. A widow would leave the deed to her acres in his care. A young couple would hand him their whole savings, everything they had scraped toward a piece of land, and he would keep it locked away and give it back on the day it was needed. And never once did a coin go missing. Adeline would watch her father lift a stone in the mill's cool underfloor, a stone that looked like every other, and set the treasures of her neighbors into the dark hollow beneath, and lower the stone again. And she understood, even as a child, that she was watching something sacred, a whole community's faith, kept in the dark under a working floor, safe because one honest man had made himself worthy of it. She married Tom Vance at 19, a gentle, laughing man who farmed the bottomland, and for a while her life ran as sweet and steady as the river. But this is the story of how the sweet things were taken one by one, until there was nothing left but a woman on the courthouse steps counting $9. The first thing the valley lost was the river itself. In the spring of 1861, a great flood came down the Kettle, the worst in living memory. And when the waters went back down at last, they had cut a new channel a quarter-mile to the east, leaving the old mill race dry and the great wheel hanging over a bed of cracked mud. A mill with no water is only a barn full of stone. Amos Kerr, old now and heartbroken, tried for 2 years to dig a new race by hand, and it was in that labor that his heart gave out. He died in the winter of 1863 with the ledger open on his knees and a job half finished, and the town buried him on the bluff and let the mill fall silent. And one by one, the families who had trusted him with their savings came asking, and were told the old man had died before he could set his affairs in order, and no one could find where anything had been kept. The strongbox, folks assumed, had been carried off. Faith, once it cracks, spreads its cracks everywhere. The town grew suspicious and small. Into that broken trust stepped Silas Thorne. He arrived from the east with a fine coat and a smooth voice, and he opened the Cedar Bluff Farmers Trust in a brick building on the square. And he told the frightened, cheated people of the valley that the old way, trusting your money to a miller, to a neighbor, was ignorance, and that the modern way was to trust it to him, to his ledgers and his iron safe. And they did, because they had nowhere else to turn. Over 30 years, Silas Thorne became the richest and most powerful man in the county, and quietly, patiently, a cruel one. He learned that a man who holds the notes on a whole valley holds the valley itself. He foreclosed slowly, courteously, always within the law, and always the land he took was the best land, and always it ended somehow in his own name. Adeline and Tom held on longer than most, because they were careful and hardworking, and because Adeline had her father's gift for making the discarded useful. But Tom fell sick the last 2 winters of his life, and the doctor cost money, and the crops those years came in thin, and to keep him warm and fed, Adeline borrowed against the farm from Thorne's bank. Tom died in the March of 1889, and Adeline had scarcely put the earth over him when Silas Thorne came to call, hat in hand, sorrowful as a preacher, and explained that the note was due and that a widow could not be expected to work the land alone, and that the kindest thing, truly, was for the bank to take the farm and settle the debt. He offered her nothing for her 30 years there. The law was on his side. Within a month, everything she and Tom had built was auctioned on those same courthouse steps, and Silas Thorne bought her bottomland for a fraction of its worth. And Adeline Vance walked out into the road with a black dress, a cough, and $9.40. She might have gone to her cousin in Kansas City. She might have taken domestic work and let the last of herself grind down to nothing. But that same afternoon, standing numb outside the courthouse, she heard the auctioneer read off the last worthless lot of the county's abandoned properties, and among them, in a bored and mocking voice, the old fen gristmill and 1 acre on the dry channel, no water rights, condition ruinous, bid opens at $8. The fen gristmill, that was what folk called it now, after the family who'd let it rot, though Adeline knew whose hands had truly built it. Her father's mill, and though a voice inside her said it was madness, that she was a homeless widow, throwing away nearly all she had for a pile of falling stone, another voice, older and deeper, the voice of a girl watching her father lower treasures into the dark, said only, "Go home." She raised her hand. No one raised one against her. The auctioneer, half laughing, brought down his gavel. For $8, Adeline Vance owned the ruin where she'd been born. She walked out to it that same evening, across the dry old channel and up the weedy bank, and she stood before the mill in the long gold light and wept, because time had been cruel to it. The roof had fallen in along the north side. Birds nested in the head race. The great wheel hung rotten and still. Inside, the floor was a wreck of collapsed timber and drifted leaves, and animals had denned in the corners, and everything wore 30 years of gray dust. But when she climbed down into the cool underfloor, where the machinery slept, she laid her hand on the cold iron of the main shaft and felt, beneath the ruin, the bones of her father's work still true. And there, in the failing light, her eye caught something she had not thought of in 30 years. Set into the underfloor was a row of flat foundation stones, and one of them she remembered now. She remembered her father's hands. One of them was not mortared like the rest. It had a shallow groove worn along one edge, the groove where a man's fingers had lifted it 1,000 times. Her heart began to pound. She was too weak and too tired that night to move it. But she slept in the least ruined corner of her father's mill wrapped in her shawl, and in the morning, with a broken bar of iron for a lever, Adeline lifted the stone. Beneath it was not a strong box. Beneath it was a hollow lined with slate, dry and clean after 30 years. And in the hollow lay a single object wrapped in oilcloth. She lifted it out with shaking hands and unwound the cloth, and found her father's great leather ledger, the very one, she was sure, that had lain open on his knees the day he died. Someone had wrapped it and hidden it here with care. Tucked into its front cover was a letter, folded and sealed, and on the outside, in Amos Kerr's slanting hand, faded but unmistakable, were written the words, "To whoever loves this mill enough to come back for it." Adeline sat down hard on the dusty floor, and for a long moment she could not breathe. Her father had known. Somehow, dying, he had known that the strong box was not lost, that his life's honest work was not a thief's crime, and he had left the truth here in the dark for someone with eyes to see. She did not yet understand what she held. She only knew with a certainty that reached back through 30 years that she had not been foolish. She had come home to something. She read the letter by the light of the doorway and read it 3 times. And each time her hands shook worse. "My child," it began, "for I trust it will be a child of mine or of this valley who finds this, since none but such would trouble to come back. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the mill is silent, and I fear our neighbors think the old miller robbed them, for I could not finish setting things right before my strength failed. Know first that I stole nothing. Every coin and deed and dollar the good people of this valley entrusted to me is safe, and I will tell you where. But there is a thing more precious than money hidden here as well, and you must understand it, for it is the true wealth of Cedar Bluff." The letter went on to explain that in his last 2 years, digging his failed race, Amos Kerr had struck something in the earth beneath the mill, not gold, but water. A deep, cold, unfailing spring, welling up from the rock far below the reach of any flood or drought, sealed off by him behind a plug of clay and timber so that it would not undermine his foundations. He had realized, too late and too weak to act, that this spring could feed a new mill race that would never run dry, that the mill could live again forever on water no flood could ever steal, and more, that such water in a valley that had begun to parch could give the whole town its life back. The location of the sealed spring and the location of the strongbox he had drawn on a map on the ledger's last page. But it was the ledger itself, when she finally opened it, that made Adeline understand the full shape of what she had found and why a powerful man might kill to keep it buried. For the ledger was not only a record of tolls and grain. In its last pages, Amos Kerr had kept, in his careful hand, an account of every coin, every deed, every family savings left in his care, with the amount and the date and the owner's name, all of it signed and witnessed. Here was the widow Aldis's $40. Here was the deed to the Peterson quarter section. Here were the savings of 11 families, sums that had seemed small then and were fortunes now, all of it presumed stolen or lost these 30 years. Adeline turned to the map on the last page. The strongbox her father had written was walled up behind the underfloor's north footing, and the spring lay 8 feet down beneath the old hearthstone. She spent that whole day at the north footing with her iron bar, and near dusk the stones gave, and she drew out into the light a black iron strongbox, heavy as sin, and when she forced the rusted lock, there lay inside, bright and untouched by 30 years, the deeds and coins and honest savings of her neighbors, the whole lost trust of Cedar Bluff, kept faithfully in the dark by a dead man's honor. She sat with it a long time in the ruined mill. A lesser woman, or a bitter one, might have taken the gold and gone, bought back her farm, bought her comfort, vanished. And Adeline was tempted. She was cold and homeless, and the world had given her every reason to take what it owed her and run. But her father's voice was in that mill as surely as the dust, and she knew the coins were not hers. Each had a name written beside it in the ledger. What was hers was the truth and the spring, and the second chance her father had left in the dark for someone with the eyes to see it. And so she made a decision that the town would tell of for 100 years. She would not take the money. She would give it back, every coin, to every name, and she would bring the mill back to life, and with it the town. But to do that, she would first have to reckon with the man who now stood, without knowing it, upon a lie 30 years deep. Because the ledger held one more account, and it was this that turned Adeline's grief to a cold and steady purpose. Among the last entries in her father's hand was a record of a large deposit, the entire proceeds of a good year's harvest from a dozen families, pooled together in 1862 to buy a great tract of the valley's best bottomland from the railroad, held in trust by the miller until the sale could be completed. The families were listed, the sum was listed, and then, in a different ink, a note her father had added near the end. The railroad man who was to complete this sale is one Silas Thorne, lately come among us. I do not trust his eyes. Adeline sat very still. She knew that bottomland. It was the richest ground in the county, and every acre of it now stood in the name of Silas Thorne, who had arrived in Cedar Bluff not as a banker at all, but as the railroad's land agent, the very man entrusted to complete a purchase for a dozen trusting families, a man who had told those families their money was lost when the miller died, and had quietly kept the land for himself, and had built his whole empire, his bank, his power, 30 years of slow foreclosure, on that first stolen trust. The farm he had taken from Adeline that spring stood on that same bottomland. He had not merely ruined her, he had built his ruin of her on the grave of her father's honor. She did not act rashly, for she had her father's patience. She told no one at first. She worked. Through the long summer of 1889, she labored alone to bring the mill back, sleeping in its dust, eating what she could snare and forage, coughing in the cold mornings and working through it. She cleared the fallen roof and patched it with split shakes. She dressed the great burstones with her father's own tools, still hanging where he'd left them. And following his map, she dug down beneath the old hearthstone, 8 feet through clay, until her spade struck the timber and clay plug her father had set. And when she broke it through, cold, clear water welled up around her boots, the sealed spring, unfailing after 30 years, exactly as he had promised. She wept, standing in it. Then she dug her father's new race, the one he had died trying to make, and it was slow and brutal work for one aging woman, but she did it foot by foot, and by the first frost the water ran, and one gray October morning Adeline Vance opened the gate, and the great wheel of the Kerr mill turned again for the first time in a quarter century, groaning, streaming, alive. The sound of that wheel carried across the valley, and folk came out to the dry channel that was dry no more to see the miracle of it, the widow they had called foolish, standing white with flour dust in the door of a working mill. But not all who came were glad. Word reached the brick bank on the square, and Silas Thorne came out himself in his fine coat to see. And Adeline watched his smooth face as he looked at the turning wheel and the running water, and she saw something flicker behind his eyes that was not wonder but fear. For a man who is buried alive beneath a mill does not like to see the mill come back to life. He offered, that very day, to buy the mill from her at a generous price, he said, far more than she'd paid, for surely a woman alone could not run such a place. Adeline looked at him a long moment and said only that the mill was not for sale, and that she thought her father would have liked to see it running. And Thorne's face went carefully blank at the word father, and he tipped his hat and rode away. And Adeline knew that she had made an enemy who would not stop at a wheel. He did not. Silas Thorne fought her the only ways his kind know how, with paper and with power. First, he sent word round the county that the old Finn mill had no water rights, that the widow Vance was running an illegal race and stealing water, and he threatened any farmer who ground his grain there with the loss of his bank credit. For a few frightened weeks, the mill stood idle again, its wheel turning for no one, while the people of Cedar Bluff, in debt to Thorne to the last man, dared not cross him. Then he moved against the deed itself, filing in the county court a claim that the auction sale had been improper, that the mill and its acre by rights reverted to the bank as an old encumbrance, and he had judges who owed him favors and lawyers who feared him, and it seemed for a while that he would simply take the mill from her as he had taken everything else, by the slow, courteous, lawful cruelty at which he was a master. Adeline had no money for lawyers. She had only a leather ledger wrapped in oilcloth, and she understood at last that the time had come to use it not for herself, but for them all. She had only a leather ledger wrapped in oilcloth, and she understood at last that the time had come to use it not for herself, but for them all. She chose her ground carefully, the way her father had taught her to read water before opening a gate. The county fair fell on the last Saturday of October, and the whole valley gathered on the square, and the court sat that day to rule on Thorne's claim to the mill, and Silas Thorne stood before his neighbors in his fine coat, certain of victory, a small, triumphant smile upon his face. And into that square walked Adeline Vance, in her gray-black widow's dress, carrying her father's ledger and the black-iron strongbox, and she asked the judge for leave to speak, and something in her quiet, upright bearing made the crowd fall silent, and the judge grant it. She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. She simply opened the ledger and began to read the names, the sums, the dates, the honest record of a dead man 30 years, slandered as a thief. She read the widow Aldis's $40, and old Mrs. Aldis, 90 now and half blind in the front row, began to weep. She read the Peterson deed and the Larson savings, and one by one the families named in that book, or their children, or their grandchildren, rose to their feet in the crowd. And then she opened the strongbox before them all and let them see it, the coins, the deeds, 30 years of lost faith, bright and whole in the autumn sun, and she said, so that all could hear, my father kept every promise he made to you. He never robbed you. He kept your trust safe in the dark until someone should come back for it. I have come back. Here is what is yours. And she began to give it back, name by name, into the hands of the astonished poor. The square was in an uproar of weeping and wonder, but Adeline was not finished, for there was one account left to read. She turned to the last page, and in the sudden hush she read her father's final entry, the pooled harvest money of 12 families, given in 1862 to the railroad's land agent to buy the valley's best bottomland, held in trust, and the agent's name written plain, Silas Thorne. And she lifted her eyes to the man in the fine coat and said that the money had never been lost when the miller died, that the land had been bought and the deed diverted, that every acre Silas Thorne called his own, his bank, his power, the very bottomland he had foreclosed from her own hands that spring, had been built upon the stolen trust of his own neighbors, and that here, in her father's witnessed hand, was the proof of it. She held up the ledger, and the crowd, which had feared Silas Thorne for 30 years, turned as one and looked at him, and in their faces was the end of his reign. He tried to speak, to smooth it over as he had smoothed over everything, but there is no smoothing over a dead man's honest ledger read aloud before a whole town. The court took the book. The suit against the mill collapsed that hour, and in the slow months that followed, the courts unwound the empire of Silas Thorne thread by thread, and the stolen bottomland was returned to the families it had been taken from, and Adeline Vance's own farm was restored to her by the same law that had stripped it away. Thorne himself was not hanged, nor beaten, nor run out with torches, for that was not the justice her father would have wanted. He was simply, finally, seen stripped of his fine coat of respectability, left to answer to the law and to the cold contempt of every neighbor he had wronged, an old man alone with the truth of himself, which for a man like Silas Thorne was the heaviest sentence of all. But Adeline did not build her life on his downfall, for that was never the point. The point was the mill, and the water, and the town. With the deep spring feeding the race, the Kerr mill would never run dry again, and Adeline threw open its doors to every farmer in the valley, and she took her toll the way her father had a fixed and modest measure, never a grain more. And she wrote every transaction in a new leather ledger in her own careful, slanting hand, so that any man could come and see he'd been dealt with square. And she did one thing more. The unfailing spring gave far more water than one mill could use. And so, with the freed and grateful families laboring beside her, Adeline dug channels out from the old race across the parched valley, and the cold, clear water her father had found and sealed away ran out at last into the fields and the gardens and the dry throats. The town came back. A store reopened on the square where the bank had been. Families who had drifted away drifted home. And at the heart of it all, turning slow and steady and full of life, was the great wheel of the mill, where a girl had once watched her father lower a whole town's faith into the dark, and where an old woman had lifted it, into the light. At 51, Adeline Vance had owned nothing but a gray-black dress, a chipped tin of coins, and a cough she could not shake, and the man who cast her out had called it kindness, and the town had called her foolish for spending nearly her last dollar on a ruin no one else would touch. But there had been something sealed beneath those millstones, quiet and patient through 30 years of dust. Not gold, though there was gold. Not water, though the water saved them all. But a truth. The truth that her father had been honest to his last breath. The truth that a whole community's trust, given away in faith and thought forever lost, had waited safe in the dark for someone with the eyes her father had taught her, the eyes that could look at a thing the world had thrown away. A ruined mill, a slandered name, a widow of 51, and still see all its worth inside it. Most everything folks throw off, he used to say, still has all its worth. They just quit looking. Adeline never quit looking, and because she did not, a forgotten valley got its heart back. That is the story of Adeline Vance, the foolish woman who bought a dead man's mill for $8 and gave a town back its life. Thank you for staying with us to the end of Adeline's story. It means more than you know that you spent this quiet hour here with us. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the things and the people the world writes off are so often the ones still holding all their worth inside, just waiting for someone to look. And before you go, we'd love for you to sit with one question and leave your answer in the comments so the rest of us can read it. What is a time you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? We read every one, and we carry them with us into the next story we tell. Until next time, friend, keep looking closely, keep your own promises well, and stay close.